Niall Gooch, welcome to Thinking Class. Thanks so much for joining me.
Well, thank you, John. Good to be here.
Well, I'm glad you're here in this digital, ethereal realm. You've made the argument that British culture is often derided and dismissed as nothing, or it's boring. And you've said, well, it's neither of those things. It's not nothing, and it's not boring. What is it that you think marks British culture out as unique and deserving of more praise?
Well, I think to me, there's an awful lot you could say there, but it's partly about the sheer longevity of the nation of Britain and of the predecessor states of the United Kingdom, England and Scotland and Wales and Ireland. I don't want to get into the Irish question, but it's a part of the culture of these islands. So I think because for such a long time you had a broadly settled population here, and you had very early development of a fairly powerful unitary state, which meant that you had a certain amount of peace, certainly by comparison with some other European countries. There's been a settled culture here for a very long time, and for whatever reason, there's a huge amount of depth and richness in that culture. And because of our role in the world over the last few hundred years, we've taken that culture elsewhere. So it's spread and it's shared. So I think it's difficult for people to recognize that it is originally a British culture, because it's become so universal. If you think of something like the parliamentary system, or sort of constitutional monarchy in its particular Anglo form, those are in many ways unique to this country, but people don't realize that. So I think the fact that Britain is an old country, and the nations have, the home nations have been within their current borders for a long time. So you've had time for this very kind of textured culture to build up, and you've had all these great writers who in some sense now belong to the world, but who were once English writers. Shakespeare is the obvious one, grew up in provincial England. So I think it's partly that the settled nature of the culture, the fact we've been here for a very long time, and the fact that there are unusual things about the English and the British that don't actually obtain so much in other countries.
The universal aspect of the British culture is certainly an interesting one, and I know you and I were talking before we pressed record. Both of us are descended from peoples on the Celtic fringe of England, but if we look specifically at England, and I suppose the English peoples, it is quite remarkable to see that what David Starkey has said is that there seems to be that David Starkey has made the point that there's something about the English people which shows that there is a deep-rooted conservatism in them, and this can be borne out within attempts at restoration to take us back to a time that was before, and whether that was either through an attempt at a Protestant Reformation to take us back to a more pure way of the Christian story, or indeed to overthrow the Stuart monarchy. But then there's also the argument you can make that the United States was the ultimate expression of Englishness and its love for liberty without any arbitrary government, and then it was enshrined within the various constitutions. And I think I read someone explain how the United States, maybe not now, but it was initially the place in which the English could go and be at home without all of that overbearing, potentially arbitrary government that had been developing over time. And it made me wonder, actually, Niall, what you think of the state of the monarchy here in Britain, because I know you think quite a lot about the health of institutions, and you've written a lot about the political institutions. But if you think about the monarchical institution, I wonder what people's relationship is to it, because one thing I've noticed on the internet is that even those who lean right, who would typically be fervent supporters of the monarchy, have been, I think, dispirited at the pronouncements of King Charles, whether it be in his Christmas speech talking about the importance of diversity and other faiths, and people saw it as quite a political intervention. And then he has marked the beginning of Ramadan recently, and there seems to be amongst right-wing pundits this feeling that the monarchy is slipping away from whatever it was that it sought to protect and maintain. Do you have any thoughts on any of those things? Is there anything there or not?
Yeah, I go back and forth on this, because I do kind of recognise the strength of the I suppose what you call the new right critique of I've heard it called Windsorism, which is that effectively the royal family, first the old Queen and now the King, have kind of bought into state ideology, particularly in the last sort of 25, 30 years, which is very much the kind of, so as you'd call it, progressive, official multiculturalism, and that by buying into that ideology, the royal family have put themselves in a very dangerous position, because formally their position depends on a kind of political neutrality. And that's been the understanding for a long time. But they seem to be moving away from that now. If you look at the kind of causes that the royals publicly attach themselves to, particularly the younger royals, I do understand why people think that, well, they're not actually politically neutral anymore. They are running cover for a particular understanding of the state. Now, the complication there is that, well, perhaps actually the strictly neutral monarchy isn't desirable. Perhaps it would be good if the monarch did stand up more for certain causes. You get into very, very difficult territory then, because I wrote an article when Charles first became king, suggesting that he could move away from his mother's model of very limited interventions in politics and carefully kind of give his views on issues where there wasn't an obvious party political position, such as architecture, certain aspects of the environment, conservation, religious freedom. So I'm very much in two minds about it, because I am attached to the monarchy, and I do see the strength of it, and I think that not having the monarchy wouldn't improve the position of British conservative, British right-wingers. But at the same time, I do agree that certainly particularly under Charles, and it had already started under the old Queen, the monarchy is becoming a tool of what you call the progressive establishment. And I think they're going to need to be very careful that they don't alienate their natural supporters, because a few years ago, for example, you had this business at a royal party where one of the older courtiers offended somebody from Afro-Caribbean community, and she was thrown under the bus. And the king and people around the king made a big deal of apologizing and trying to make peace with the person in question. Forgive me, I've forgotten her name, but that seemed to me a mistake, because it annoyed a lot of traditional supporters of the monarchy. It was a storm in a teacup, just a very small lapse in manners potentially. But the monarchy was going out of its way to abase itself before people who are never really going to like it and don't particularly, and arguably have an axe to grind against the traditional institutions and organisation of Britain. So I think it's a very dangerous time for the monarchy, because as you've got, demographic change, you've got an increasing number of people who don't have the kind of they don't have the law of the tribe. They don't have that kind of visceral attachment to the monarchy that is more common among the I'm not sure what the right word is. I'll say indigenous population. That's not quite right. But take me for example. My grandfather fought in the Second World War. My great grandfather fought in the First World War. My family has been in this country for generations and has fought for it and has defended for it. So that gives you a kind of deep link to something like the monarchy in a way that newcomers, I'm not saying they don't or can't have it. I'm just saying it's more difficult for them to acquire, and it's not an instinct for them in the same way, particularly when you've got huge numbers of incomers coming constantly, which makes integration harder. So, yes, I think that's quite a long answer, but I think it's a very difficult and dangerous time for the monarchy. They need to secure their support from the people who are actually traditionally inclined to support them.
This is the place for long answers, Niall, so you never have to apologise for that. Staying on institutional trust, that's a cornerstone of what it means for England and then Britain to have a monarchy. So that's a very interesting question, and one that the answer will unfold before us and indeed through the generations long beyond our time here. Which other institutions are currently low in trust? And what is it that you think needs to be done to rebuild the trust? Why have they reached such a nadir, and how do they get out of it?
Well, I think I can't actually think of many institutions that have kind of maintained their prestige beyond a relatively narrow belt. I think most traditional institutions are struggling because there's a very strong disconnect, I think, between whatever you want to call them, the intelligentsia, the chattering classes, whatever the cliche you want to pick. The people who tend to staff institutions are disassociated from what you call sort of patriotic, normal, mainstream views in a way that I don't think has ever happened before. So if you think of something like the Church of England. Now, I used to be a member of the Church of England, and I'm not anymore. So I'm quite careful in how I talk about the Church of England. But the Church of England has traditionally been, to put it simply, is a kind of chaplaincy to the establishment, which has worked very, very well as long as the establishment is broadly Christian and broadly sort of in tune with what the Church is seeking to do. And the kind of people from whom Anglican clergy are drawn, again, they're sort of mainstream, middle-class, intelligent people. And what you've got now is that those people aren't conservatives anymore, or mostly aren't conservatives anymore. If I think back to the people I went to university with, almost none of them are conservatives. Even people who've gone into the professions, people who 40 or 50 years ago would definitely have been conservatives, are not now. So I think a lot of institutions are staffed by people who have come through the universities in the last sort of 3 or 4 decades, where the academic culture is increasingly, I suppose, kind of post-national, liberal, multicultural, and views those things as not even political positions, but just the normal thing that sensible, educated people think. This is one of the frustrations, I'm sure you'll have come across it, with talking to people about politics, is that people often don't recognise that the view they're taking is contentious. So if you think of something like equality and diversity training, people find it hard to understand being opposed to it because they think, it's just encouraging people to be nice. And why would you be against equality and diversity without recognising that equality and diversity kind of embeds a particular understanding of the world, a particular view of equality and of relations between people. So it's seen as the default rather than a political position. So I think, the difficulty is that institutions are staffed by people who are who don't really have faith in what the institution originally set up to do, and also don't have faith in the possibility of a kind of non-political realm. So if you think of something like, there's been a lot of complaints recently about museums becoming, decolonializing their collections and that sort of thing. Now, if you say to someone, a curator at a museum, well, actually, museums, as far as possible, shouldn't actually be political. They should be about teaching people about particular things, informing the public about ancient Egypt or ancient China or British history or French history or Renaissance art, or whatever the subject of that museum is. And I don't think a lot of people who've been through British universities in the last few decades would accept that you can have that non-political space. I think that's one of the main problems we have, is that non-political spaces are shrinking because people don't accept the concept of a non-political space. If that makes sense.
It does make sense. And there's actually lots in there that I'd love to delve into a bit more. Let's focus on political spaces, though, because in the last week, we're recording last day of February 2025. In the last week, one of the news items has been on how there have been the switching around of certain artworks in the Houses of Parliament. And this has included the removal of figures like Lord Nelson, as well as other luminaries from British history, folks who have been the leaders of various war efforts that have secured the independence of the nation, fought great efforts to make sure that Britain keeps some level of primacy in the corner of the world in which it inhabited and beyond. And so has rightly been written into the record books. They have been replaced with pictures of people like Yvette Cooper, current Home Secretary, former Prime Minister Theresa May, and several other women or anyone from a parliamentary background who perhaps represents an ethnic minority background. We're talking very recent politicians who have now been put up in place of these national luminaries, as we talked about. And this created quite a lot of comment, not just on the right online. You had those who represent the old left, like Paul Embury, calling out how this just seems like a desecration of national history in some way, and a replacement and a rewriting of history. And I just wonder if that mindset, that worldview which you've just described, and those people who hold it, would have even flinched at the prospect of removing these artworks, which even, Prime Minister Starmer removed paintings of Churchill, Thatcher, found himself sitting alongside Donald Trump and JD Vance this week, saying, "Isn't it great that Churchill's back where he belongs in the Oval Office?" Almost the irony not lost on him, or perhaps it was. I just wonder, besides the neutral spaces shrinking, do you think that even the highly politicized acts taking place within the political spaces, that that doesn't raise eyebrows anymore?
Yeah, it's strange because to me, I don't understand how they are. I can't imagine being so impressed with myself that I put a portrait of myself up instead of someone like Nelson or Churchill. It's a very strange mindset to me. But I think as well, it's I mentioned earlier about the idea of the intelligentsia now almost being post-national and very wary of any kind of sort of patriotic or anything that's got patriotic connotations or feels like it's celebrating, the old Britain. So I think the reason that's happening is that there's a kind of year zero mentality, which is that Britain began at a pinch. Really, it began in 1948, with the founding of the NHS and the Empire Windrush. And old Britain is something that we emerged from. So in a sense, there's been an attempt, I think, almost to refound the country, if that doesn't sound too strange, and to make us, it's why you get, this talk of Britain being a nation of immigrants and these kind of obviously untrue statements about kind of historic British identity and the way things have worked historically. There's a very strong movement to kind of push those things to one side and to emphasize the, what they call British values now, or alleged British values, and to center not a distinct national history of a people in a place and of particular institutions, particular achievements that the British people have made, but to replace that with a kind of ideologically focused new world. So that's why, Nelson and Churchill are out, because they represent that old world. And paintings of the first female chancellor or Yvette Cooper, they represent the new world of, I suppose, kind of universalist ideals of the rejection of the old pale, male and stale, Christian settlement. That their whole life and education and upbringing has encouraged them to reject that and look upon it as a kind of benighted past. So in a way, it's not surprising that they've got no kind of attachment to that past, because there's no reason why they would have, being raised in the post-60s world. I mentioned earlier about, I wrote a piece about Starmer last year, and I mentioned, I think, that he's the first prime minister who really strikes me as being a completely post-1960s person, in the sense that he has no kind of instinctive fondness or love of British institutions. He's an unambiguously atheist. He's never shown any kind of interest in British history. There's a sense that he's one of the new men, if you like, who the big rupture in the 60s and 70s, and the ongoing rupture really, was designed to produce. That's not to say that he is necessarily a communist, as some of the more excitable opponents say, but he's a product of the new world, if you like. So the old Britain of wood panelled rooms and oil paintings of great national figures, that means nothing to him and to the people around him.
I think it's probably hard to argue with that estimation. And I know when asked what his favourite book is, his favourite poem, and his favourite piece of music, I don't think he could answer any of those questions. He didn't have one, and doesn't dream either, which is a remarkable thing to admit to. But perhaps, and this sounds very partisan, but it's not meant to be. But perhaps this lack of creativity just doesn't bother him at all. He's not there to be creative. He's there to be effective in whatever way he sees fit, and whatever fits with his legalistic worldview. But that's another point. And I think let's linger on worldview a moment. So I know I have people who wonder whether this podcast can linger too much on the topic of immigration. However, I think it's quite hard to not focus on immigration with regards to the impact that it has on a country and its culture and its institutions. And that was partly why I set the podcast up, to talk about what makes cultures and institutions and civilizations, and the things that might actually make them fray or hasten their demise. And I think mass immigration is one of those things. And I think it's probably fair to say that when someone like Matt Goodwin jumps up on TV and talks about all of the ways, he brings fact after fact after fact of how much it hits the public purse. He brings all of the crimes that are being committed, all these data points, all of these points being buried by people in positions of authority. And once he's typically minced a few of his opponents, the opponent, whether on Question Time or whatever, whether it's Labour minister, they always fall back on, do you want to live in the kind of country that doesn't accept refugees or asylum seekers? And let's linger on that point a little bit, because you're a journalist, a Christian. You've written about balancing kindness, judgment, and justice as Christians, and I suppose secularists with Christian operating systems, whether they recognize it or not. And you don't necessarily have to riff off the immigration point, but there are lots and lots of pressures on Britain today, and I suppose much of the Western world, which strains people's moral operating systems, and is making people respond in ways in which may not immediately seem to chime with something like the Christian worldview. So I suppose my question, Niall, is how does one balance kindness, judgment, and justice, whether you're a Christian or you're just operating with a Christian mindset? And what might that mean for public policy in some of these hot button areas?
It's a very difficult one. I mean, something I've been thinking about, and I'm hoping to write a piece about at some point, is the way in which I think all political perspectives and all political viewpoints, in a sense, need Christianity to be a kind of a civilizing force, because all political ideologies have, I suppose, what you'd call a failure mode. So for my own politics, which is kind of traditionally conservative and sort of, I suppose, patriotic, that the failure mode is pretty well known, because if you go too far, you get a kind of hard-edged nationalism, you get racial bigotry, and xenophobia and all those kind of things. So, and maybe on the left, if you take kind of generally left-wing principles, and those aren't leavened by an understanding of the importance of the individual and of freedom, you get the terrible communist tyrannies we've seen in the 20th century and still today. So I suppose that the difficulty is working out how the Christian principles translate from the individual perspective, the individual imperative, up to the level of the state. Because it's one thing, for example, when Jesus says turn the other cheek, that's given as an instruction to us as individuals and as maybe as communities and churches. But at the level of the state, well, surely that can't mean that we don't have a criminal justice system, for example. Or sometimes Christians on the left refer to the early church as having everything in common. But again, that's a voluntary arrangement that they came to. And I think the evidence is pretty clear that trying to force people to have everything in common on the national scale doesn't work. So I think you need to be really careful about what are commands for individuals and for communities and churches, and there are a lot of those, and which are commandments about how countries should be run. And I suppose the other point is that I think Christians who are thinking about politics need to work through is when there's a direct threat, when there's some clear Christian principle at stake, that's where there's a real important opportunity for Christians to speak to a particular problem. So where human dignity is compromised, or where there's a very clear violation, that's where a Christian voice can be really loud, where trade-offs don't really come into it. So something like assisted suicide, abortion, these kind of issues, where there's a clear kind of Christian principle, or even the basics of a welfare state. You cannot not have a welfare state if you want to have a Christian politics, because you need to have that baseline level of support for the poor. So there's a kind of human dignity angle there. But most political issues aren't really like that. They're about trade-offs. They're about weighing competing priorities. It's like, immigration is the big one that's in the news at the moment, as you've mentioned. And again, there's so many different trade-offs there to think about. With kind of the welfare of newcomers, the welfare of the existing population, and whether you need to kind of maintain a certain level of prosperity in order to keep on being able to welcome other people in future. It's like, the idea of if you let the country become too chaotic and disorderly, you can't help people in the future. It's like, you have to it's the idea of being physically fit so that you can help other people. So there's all these difficult trade-offs and competing priorities. You could say the same about tax rises. You could say, well, it's important for the wealthy to pay more tax so we can redistribute wealth. But then you say, well, that has downsides too, because taxing wealth, taxing business more seems to reduce growth, which means there's less money to go around for everyone. So there's all these different trade-offs. So I think Christians need to be really careful to kind of distinguish situations where there's a very clear principle that, maybe something that's intrinsically wrong, and other situations, which are most political questions, where there's a lot of trade-offs.
I also wonder if we can extend this this question of how institutions orient themselves in the face of extraordinary circumstances, from the role of the state and how they might respond to something like immigration with a sense of Christian justice and ideals, to the source of Christianity in the West, the Roman Church. So I watched yesterday Conclave for the first time. I don't watch a lot of TV or movies, but my fiance was insistent that we should watch it. And anyway, we watched it. And I'm going to say to anyone who hasn't seen it that I'm about to engage in a spoiler. I don't usually like to do this, but perhaps you want to tune out for 5-10 minutes. Have you seen it, Niall?
I haven't, but I've heard quite a lot about it. I know the twist.
Okay, well, I'm not going for the twist, but I suppose this probably won't be too much as a spoiler as someone who's a Catholic, because we see it playing out within the actual church. But there's a storyline in there which is ultimately about which kind of candidate, what's the profile of the candidate who's going to become the new pope. And I'm not going to say who it centers around, you might go and watch it, but there's an Italian conservative called Tedesco. And then there's the person who turns out to be what the twist centers around. And there's a few different twists in there. But long story short is, during the course of the film, as they are sequestered in the various rounds of voting to try and get the 72 votes they need to elect a new pope, is you have those agitating around the conservative view saying, guys, the liberalizing of the church hasn't been good at all. In fact, if anything, it's divided us. Where Latin used to be the unifying language, now we all talk amongst ourselves in our own languages, and our tables in the canteen are divided out by the Africans and the Spanish and the Italians, the English. And look, the liberalizing of the church has led to social anomie, as it were. And then effectively what happens are there are a few terrorist explosions that are taking place outside, one in Rome, and then a week later, or maybe even a couple of days later, more take place. Another one in Munich, another one in a French city, and then another one basically right outside of St. Peter's. And they couldn't keep this from the popes, basically. Oh, sorry, not the popes, the cardinals. They're usually trying shield them from what's going on outside so it doesn't influence their decision. And effectively, at this point, we've seen a terrorist attack. It's insinuated that it's an Islamic terrorist attack. And the Italian conservative says, this is what decades of cultural relativism have led us to. We can't recognize that there's a religious war going on here. We can't recognize that our societies, these Catholic cities, are under threat. And we need to know what we stand for. And we need to not be afraid to put up borders effectively around the world that we wish to preserve. And we're the fount of that civilization. So we need to move back in this direction. You guys have led us down the path. And then effectively, the chap Benitez, who the twist centers around, he stands up and says that the church is not the past. The church is not a tradition. It's about now. It's about going forward. And you know nothing of war, and effectively goes down the route of saying that we need not indulge in that worldview that had just been passionately fought for by the other candidate. Anyway, he goes. The liberal goes on to become the Pope, as it were. And I suppose my question to you, as someone who has been part of the Church of England, moves to the Catholic Church, is what you make of those worldviews that duke it out. Because many see Pope Francis as being a similar type to Benitez, who I've just described, and Pope Benedict is perhaps more the Tedesco conservative chap. What kind of a Catholic Church do you think? Well, are you for? Is it an and or? Is it a both of those and something else? What do you think the Church could and can do? Huge question, but interested to hear what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I mean, there's a writer on a Catholic priest, another convert, who he has this idea of the great thing about the Catholic Church and Catholic theology and practice and devotion is that it tries to be both and rather than either or. And what he means by that is that, so he came out of an evangelical Protestant background, where there were certain things that were rejected. So, the strength of evangelicalism is sort of biblical scholarship and worship and discipleship, but they don't have, from the Catholic perspective, they don't have the same sacramental life. They don't have the same kind of enduring traditions and structure. And so that this Dwight Longnecker, this guy's name is a beautiful American name. He says, well, when he became a Catholic, it wasn't a question of rejecting his evangelicalism. It was kind of building on it and being both and. So to me, I always think, well, very often in church disputes, the sides are both right, and sometimes both wrong at the same time. Because I think it's certainly true that you can't have a church, a Christian church, unmoored from tradition and the legacy of the last 2,000 years, because by definition, that is that's what the faith is. And it's very important to hold to traditional understandings. That goes all the way back to St. Paul and to the apostles, who are recorded as saying, hold fast to the things you've been given. But equally, I think tradition can become its own kind of idol, if that's not too harsh a word to use it. So I suppose that the church always has to keep in mind what it's for, which is to, I suppose, bring the gospel of a person, Jesus Christ, to the world. And to do that, you do need to be grounded in tradition, but you do need to be conscious of how the world is changing and how you best communicate with people, and whether the kind of words and concepts you choose to explain things are the most suitable ways of doing that. So it's not about changing the substance of the faith, because I think that's a concern that traditionalists often rightly have, which is that revisionists will, under the cover of changing the methods of communication, they will actually try to change the substance of the teaching. But you need to hold fast to the teaching while thinking about how you communicate it, how you explain it, how you make it present in the world, if that doesn't sound too pretentious. So I think, in a sense, I am a conservative, a traditionalist in most respects, but I do think that it's always worth keeping in mind the point that the liberals, for want of a better word, will say about the way that the world changes, so the way you need to explain things changes. So to me, I think there's a tension there, and I think it's a useful tension, and I think you'll often get popes from different sort of sides of the church who have different emphases, and I think that's probably good for us. So, Benedict was a very scholarly, precise sort of man. If he hadn't become a priest, he would have been a great academic. Well, he was a great academic and a great theologian. But Francis, although he's not a precise thinker, he's not really a systematic thinker. He's got a really good eye for the grand kind of loving gesture. So there's a lot of photos of him, for example, embracing terribly disfigured people and disabled children. And not that Benedict didn't do those things, but I suppose the point I'm making is that there's so much in Catholicism. It's so rich. There's so many different things you might emphasize that it's actually good to have people with different strengths and different understandings. So you've got classically the church has always had monastics. It's had people who live a very enclosed, prayerful life. It's had evangelists. It's had all sorts of weird and wonderful saints, and they're all doing something good, but not everyone can do all the different good things.
Yes, very salient point. When you come to think of it, think of a Saint Francis known for his environmentalism, or St. Cuthbert of Northumbria also. Yes, I suppose you got any number of saints which they are known for something and the patron saint of something because of their very specific life that they lived and a very different part of life that they contributed to and were, the ultimate role model for it, I suppose. A very good point. Niall, starting to bring an end to the main part of the episode before we open into the exclusive Substack Q&A, there is one question that I'd like to ask all of my guests here on Thinking Class, which is, what have you changed your mind on in the course of your life that made you think differently?
I suppose, yeah. So I've touched on becoming a Catholic, which I suppose is a pretty big change, and that's a huge subject, really. But I think on some kind of other issues, 20 years ago when I was a student, I was a very enthusiastic neocon. I supported things like the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq very strongly. And I think over the last 2 decades, I think I definitely changed my mind about Western countries' ability to change, to do that kind of nation building and that kind of idealistic intervention. I don't think I'd say it can never be done, because obviously it's been done on a smaller scale and had some success. But I suppose I'm a much more realist in foreign affairs than I ever was. I think I wouldn't say I was kind of cynical, but I think I'm much more conscious of the fact that it's very difficult to change a country. It's very expensive. And I think maybe as I've got older as well, and since having children, I've become more kind of instinctively hostile to war. Not that I'm a pacifist, not that I'm against having a military and using it when we need to, but I think 20 years ago I imagined myself, when I watched a war film, you imagine yourself as the soldier, and now that I'm in my early 40s, I've started imagining myself as the parent at home worrying about their son. Maybe that comes to everyone at some point. So I'm a lot more skeptical about intervention. I'm a lot more of I don't know whether peacenik is quite the right word, but the more of history I read, the more you become aware of just the sheer misery of war and the disruption and the way it mars, it damages culture, it disrupts families. So I suppose, I've become much more of a peacenik than I was 20 years ago. That's one of the big changes, and I think that's partly to do with becoming a Catholic as well. Is just thinking a bit more about what the Church says about war and peace, and reading some of the quite challenging documents that have been put out over the years. And I do believe in just war theory, for example, but I've read some really interesting critiques of just war theory and of the danger of using it as a kind of tick box exercise to get to a war that we really want to do. So I think that's one of the big ones is my skepticism about intervention and war.
I think the skepticism about intervention is generally growing, and I know what's happening in in America with its vibe shift represents that on a grand national scale. The idea of America first. Let's not get involved. But I'd say besides people like yourself, driven by conscience and obviously your own practical experience, having become a father and what have you, I think there is also an understanding that peoples are different, cultures are different, they are deep rooted, and it is fanciful to suggest that you can go and, as you say, do some nation building and build it in whatever image it is that you're seeking to aim for, because culture runs deep. And I wonder if that does become even more noticeable now that those of us in the West do live alongside people of very, very different cultures with very different social mores, that even living alongside one another in the same nation shows that there are differences there. And in many ways, they get exacerbated by being side by side rather than fizzle out. So it's going to be even harder when you're trying to run a transcontinental war with a people that you, up until the last 70, 80 years, never really had any sizable contact with and cultural transfer with. So very, very interesting point, and no one's ever brought that up before in that section. Niall, before we move to the exclusive Q&A, let's take this opportunity to tell the listeners where they can find your work. I know we've mentioned a few of the publications you typically write for, and is there anything that people can expect for you coming out in the near future?
Well, I think I churn out a pretty steady stream of articles in UnHerd, Spectator, Catholic Herald, occasionally the Critic, but also later this year I'm self-publishing a detective story that's just coming out in the early summer, and then towards the end of the year a book of ghost stories as well. So those are the two kind of big writing projects for the year.
Wow. What made you choose self-publishing over going down the finding a publisher route?
I think it just it's a very difficult world to get into, and there's a lot of, I don't know a lot about it, honestly, but just going through the editing process and the sort of the rejections, and it's such a competitive field that it just felt like a lot of extra work for not much extra benefit. Because in a sense, I don't no one makes a living from writing novels. So, and I don't need to to make a living from writing novels. So, in a sense, I'd much rather have complete control over what I'm putting out, and only make a relatively small amount of money from it, rather than go through all the rejections and editing processes. But I don't know. It's something I thought about. But we'll see, I guess.
That makes sense to me. A similar thought process. So I'm frameworked a book, and then it made me go, why do that when what I could do is put the chapters out on Substack as I write them. It can go alongside the podcast. That helps give things back to my paid subscribers. And then at the end of it, I can package it up into a self-published book for many of the same reasons that you've explained there. So anyway, good luck with that. It sounds like a big break from the things that you typically write about. So I'm sure very refreshing. And Niall, on that note, I will bid you farewell from the main episode, and we'll move right into the exclusive subscriber Q&A for my Substack subscribers. Thank you so much for joining me. It's been great, and I'm glad we finally had the chance to speak, notwithstanding all of the technical issues, which I think I may have caused. So thanks for your enduring patience, and I hope we get to speak again, Niall.
No problem. Well, thanks for having me on, John. It's been really good.
Glad to hear it. Take good care. To keep up to date with all that I am doing, please subscribe to the Thinking Class YouTube channel at Thinking Class and follow me on X at Thinking Classes. Thinking Class seeks to understand the civilizational issues we face and why what our leaders do in response matters. Here, I seek to explore the ideas, values, and culture that made our civilization, those that are unmaking it, and how leaders at our public and private institutions should respond. Engage with me on YouTube or X, or write to me at thinkingclasspod@gmail.com to tell me who you want me to speak to and what topics are important to you. I look forward to seeing you there and for joining me on this journey.